thanks everybody for the invitation to present this opening keynote. It was a great pleasure, actually, to get the email when I asked, how long have I got to speak? And it was, the response was 40 minutes. Now, in this day and age where communications at conferences has been reduced to 5-minute sound bites on panels facilitated by moderators who are the actual integrators of knowledge rather than the speakers, it was a very refreshing invitation. I felt like somebody switched on the oxygen. So this was, I was interpreting what this was about, and when I was asked what am I going to talk about, I thought I'd share some of my more recent work, which is really a combination of activities for the National Planning Commission, thinking about financing infrastructure and industrial policies. But I'm also the co-lead author of the next economic report on Africa, which is the flagship report produced every year by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa and is presented at the plenary of the Summit of Ministers of Economics and Finance every year. And the theme of that report for 2024 is investing in sustainability transitions in Africa. Now, if any of you know anything about UNECA, you'll be surprised that they even know how to spell sustainability. It's a group of the most influential macroeconomists on the continent. And it was very surprising for my colleague Desta Mabratu and I to be requested to draft something like this. And it just says something about the way in which the challenge of sustainable resource use is getting integrated into the discussions on the African continent about future development pathways that cannot copy the pathways that were followed in every other region. So Africa is the only region in the world that has to face the fundamental development challenges in a carbon and resource constrained global environment. And inevitably that means thinking differently. And even for UNECA. So I think that's a sign, I think, of where the conversation is going. But I'd like to start by, in a sense, dispelling what is often referred to as Afro-pessimism. So I've just used the covers of The Economist magazine to show you how most of them are, on the whole, negative about, create negative imaging of Africa and Africa's challenges. That slowly started to shift with the Africa Rising narrative. But even the way the Africa Rising narrative is articulated is somewhat, doesn't quite break from the colonial lenses that are used to understand the African challenge. And so I need to start off by discussing the challenges by also noting the advantages. So some of those obviously include some of the immense resource advantages on the African continent. And in particular, when you think of the kinds of resources that are going to be needed for the energy transition, almost all of them are on the African continent. The total value in 2019 of the tons of minerals that were extracted is over 400 billion. If you look at Africa's in the context of the global population, Africa is growing faster than any other region. Most of the demographic projections about the future of the African population have been proven wrong. So nearly 1 out of 2 people on the planet are going to be Africans relatively soon. It also has will have the largest labor force by 2060, as you can see here, as labor forces decline in other parts of the world. Africa is peaking, and Africa also has the youngest population. 70% are under the age of 30. And therefore, it's not surprising that that sub-Saharan Africa is where you have the largest number of mobile money transactions compared to any other region. So that big blue sway, that's sub-Saharan Africa. The rest of all the other regions are above that. If you look at where some of Africa's key entrepreneurial activities are taking place, these are some of the fastest growing economies on the African continent. Yes, some of them off a very low base. But if you look at real GDP per growth during the 2019-2023 period, Africa is not doing too badly. In terms of who is investing in infrastructures on the African continent, well, obviously China is the biggest player from outside of Africa, but African governments are bigger than China. And that's a significant shift and says something about the changing dynamics of governance on the African continent. If you look at FDI relative to GDP, the African region is one of the highest. If you look at where the equity investors are, and in other words, these are African-based equity funds. This is just a graphic representation of how many there are and where many of them are clustered and located around the world. And you can see some, I don't know if you can see on the left here, the concentration of where these equity funds tend to go. Not enough, in my view, into infrastructure. If you look at where Africa's startup activity is concentrated, these are the key countries that really matter. But Lagos is by far and away Africa's startup capital. So if you shift now the lens to the environmental challenges that Africa faces, if you look at this heat map of the world, Africa stands out as the continent which is going to be experiencing the effects of climate change, even though it has contributed least to making it happen, and have got and are least prepared for the consequences. And that combination of factors is starting to filter in. If you were at the Africa Climate Summit in September, and if you read the Nairobi Declaration that came out of that extraordinary summit, you will see that this reality is very much front and center of the leading discussions on the continent about future development pathways. But it's not just climate change. If you look at the environmental challenges on the African continent, species extinction is the fastest in the world. Per capita natural capital decline is alarming, which is going to have a negative impact on GDP growth in the near future. Some 1.2 billion Africans could face water pollution exposure by 2050. 1.5 billion could be facing food insecurity by 2050. And coastal erosion is going to affect many of the coastal towns and cities. And Africa's aquifers actually contain more water than are in the rivers and the dams. And it therefore follows, given the size of the African population, over 1 billion now and growing, that how Africa manages its water will actually determine how the world manages its water. And so it's, according to the State of Environment report of 2023, it's an obvious statement that Africa's prosperity is heavily dependent on the preservation, conservation, and restoration of its natural resource base. And if it doesn't do that, that has very serious long-term consequences for whatever development pathway you may have in mind. Now, what's interesting is Africa's installed generation capacity is equal to that which exists in France, with a population of 140 million or so, with Africa as a population over 1 billion. So we have basically a minuscule energy generation capacity. If Africa energizes using fossil fuels, none of the targets agreed in Paris in 2015 can be achieved. And that's a harsh, brutal scientific fact. It hardly ever really enters the global imaginary in sustainability circles, because I have a feeling that underneath there's a kind of subconscious belief that Africa is never going to achieve its development targets, and therefore we really don't need to worry about whether they're going to start putting too much CO2 into the atmosphere. And that's part of the deeper, almost subconscious Afro-pessimism that we need to go up against and say, yes, Africa is going to meet its development challenge. It is going to need massive quantities of energy. And so we don't talk about decarbonization on the African continent. We talk about low carbon energization to drive the development vision and industrial policies that are required. And that's a very different way of thinking about the challenge. Just think of the African continent and kind of map onto that the key resources: solar in the southwest and the north, hydro through the Rift Valley and southwards, the geothermal and the wind resources in the northwest and southwest. So this is just in a sense a kind of representation of the renewables potential of the African continent that needs to feed our imaginary of what the development challenges are. But I think it's worth here at this point flagging what not many people realize is that South Africa has 3 significant firsts. It was the first to include the just transition in its nationally determined contribution document. It was the first to include social and economic development criteria into its auction mechanisms, which became the global standard for procuring renewables. And it was the first to publish a just energy transition investment plan, initially announced at COP26 and then announced by the task team that the president appointed and presented at COP27. And that's the basis, of course, of the $8.5 billion pledge, which we still has to materialize. Some people think it won't. But what's significant about that document is that it costed the transition for the next 5 years at 1.5 trillion. $8.5 billion is only 10% of that. So what the cabinet did in approving this document is basically say 90% has to be mobilized from domestic funding resources, which is possible, but it's not how the discussion is often framed. So if we just, the African Renewable Energy Initiative and various other initiatives since then, this was announced in 2015 at the Paris conference, and various other initiatives have escalated the ambition, all point to the need to think about the African development pathway along the lines that you can find very well articulated in the Nairobi Declaration, which I will come to. But the narrative is not just about Africa rising, it's also about Africa uprising. Africa is currently going through its 3rd great wave of uprisings. The first uprisings got rid of colonialism in the 50s and 60s. The second wave of uprisings got rid of the dictatorships in the 90s. And now we're going through the 3rd wave of uprisings with some reversals like Sudan and North Africa, but it's not that clear what's going to be left behind. They've always left something, it's like a glacier, you know, crunches its way through, and what's left behind is very different to what was there before. But it is that Africa uprising is coupled to political elite activity to improve governance. And this is the AU governance report that I'm signaling here, which needs to be read in the context of the founding of the African continental free trade area. And I don't think it's really possible to think coherently about industrial policy on the African continent, given the relatively small countries, except for 1 or 2, and therefore relatively small national markets. Industrial policy needs bigger markets. And so the founding of the free trade area is a significant contextual framing of what needs to be the next round of discussions, which is not just about infrastructure, but also about industrial policy. And I'll come to that in a second. It's obviously something you know more about than me. But before I carry on and talk about the Nairobi Declaration, I think it's important to signal that the conversations and dialogues and narratives on the African continent reflect four ways of understanding the just transition, which is this language that South Africa put onto the global agenda. And now everybody's incorporating just transitions into their NDCs. The first is it's just about decarbonization. And Rand Merchant Bank put out a statement in the middle of last year during another stage 6 crisis, where they said, just accelerate the decommissioning of coal-fired power, accelerate the commissioning of renewables. That's going to trigger more rapid economic growth, and that will enable the trickle-down economics that is going to deal with the problem of unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the traditional, if you like, market economics perspective. That is the second one, is probably the most widely held, which is it's about low carbon energization, or if you like, decarbonization if you're in South Africa, plus social mitigation. In other words, dealing with the consequences of those coal workers and communities, or fossil fuel workers and communities that are going to be impacted by a low carbon transition. The third is the one that my colleague and I, Destin Mabratu, and I will be pushing in the UNECA report that'll come out next year, which is a low carbon transition plus social mitigation plus upstream industrialization. And that really is a framing that is different to low carbon transition plus welfare interventions. That's welfare economics. So the first one is trickle down market economics. The second is welfare economics. The third is industrial policy, where, and I'll come say more about that because we need to rethink what we mean by industrial policy. But that does have implications for, say, for example, for many African countries where you think not just about low carbon for the sake of the climate, but low carbon for green industrial transformation, which is a phrase that is used frequently by our Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, Ibrahim Patel. And then the fourth position is essentially those who argue that a just transition is only possible as part of a post-capitalist transition or transformation. So these are the four narratives. I think that what I'm going to say from here onwards is a bit more located in that third position, where we have to correlate our understanding of infrastructure investments, and there's a big question how that is financed, and industrial policy. So coming to the Nairobi Declaration, which I have to kind of read it every now and again, depending on what I'm working on, because it really is significant and profound. And I just want to read section 18, emphasize that Africa possesses both the potential and the ambition to be a vital component of the global solution to climate change. As home to the world's youngest and fastest growing workforce, coupled with massive untapped renewable energy potential, abundant natural assets, and an entrepreneurial spirit, our continent has the fundamentals to spearhead a climate compatible pathway as a driving, cost competitive industrial hub with the capacity to support other regions in achieving their net zero ambitions. This is a very ambitious statement to come out of really the heartland of an African discussion. Now, in order to make sense of this and to take us into a deeper understanding of the industrial policy and financing challenges, I think we need to accept that there are three theories of change in sustainability. The one is consumption-oriented, greening consumption behavior, essentially. And the upstream industrial implications of that are largely ignored. Basically, just get as many people with solar rooftops into EVs, into eating low-carbon food, or whatever the case may be. Just change consumption behavior. When applied to the African context, it basically means import everything you're going to need so that you decarbon, so that you energize as quickly as possible in a low-carbon way. That's going to have negative implications for economic development. The second theory of change focuses almost entirely on the firm level greening, and that's what ESG is all about. And the massive rise of ESG all around the world is obviously being applied to African companies, especially in the context of trade. And yes, of course, firm level greening is important, just as the greening of consumption is important, but on their own are not sufficient if you are thinking about structural transformation. And that's where the third theory of change, which is systemic change, and in particular industrial policy, really matters. It means taking industrial policy seriously, not just at the level of verbiage, and not just for big economies. And that might mean also questioning the traditional conception of comparative advantage as a static condition, rather than a condition that can be made through learning. And I'll come back to that proposition. So I think when it comes to thinking about industrial policy, we need to shift away from first generation industrial policies, which were really about picking winners, allowing the state to effectively do the picking of those winners, subsidizing profits, distorting competitive dynamics, and often in the end resulting in rent-seeking behavior. The second generation, which is particularly emphasized by the London-based economist Marianne Mazzucato in much of her writing and all her collaborations, including she's a member of the South African President's Presidential Economic Advisory Council. Second generation industrial policies are about mission-led strategic perspectives. They're about the co-creation of value, setting direction, facilitating joint strategies, and are enabled by political settlements between elites rather than competitive factional battles, which really deplete confidence. And as she puts it, it's not about leveling playing fields, it's about tilting the playing field in a certain direction. And that's really what green industrial transformation is about. And I tried to operationalize that in a report that I did for UNECA's Central African office. The Central African sub-region is 11 African countries stretching from kind of Rwanda up in the north, across the central countries down to Angola in the southwest. So it's a kind of broad spread across Central Africa. And they had a summit and they wanted to deal with this topic which they chose, which is fostering leadership and transformative change for economic diversification in Central Africa. And the problem statement was, we've had many summits, many declarations, many reports, many public statements about what happened, but nothing really changes. So what should we be doing and thinking about? And the whole report was really an attempt to reconstitute our understanding of leadership, not as great men and women, but as coalitions and partnerships that come together to create protected spaces for competent groups of people to get stuff done. For the South Africans in the room, a good model might be Operation Vulindlela in the presidency. But what lies at the heart of this report and much of this work by African scholars is a questioning of the traditional concept of comparative advantage. The notion that it's fixed and that you now make strategy in accordance to a fixed conception of comparative advantage, which doesn't take into account that you can actually do something about your comparative advantage and put in place capabilities, institutional arrangements, funding, and infrastructures that could change your positioning. And that's particularly true now when you think about the changing nature of comparative advantage within the wider context of the free trade era. So that's if you like, some provocative statements on how we need to rethink what industrial policy is. I'm not equipped to make the next leap, which you must make, which is what is the implications of that for industrial engineering. So I wanted to shift and just look at the question of financing, and just signal to you three of the most influential estimates on the continent of what is required to achieve the to achieve the goals of the nationally determined contributions. So every African country has an NDC. What is it going to be? What is it going to take to achieve them. So the Climate Policy Initiative estimates 277 billion to achieve them. And they estimate that the current level of investment is at 30 billion per annum, and therefore the gap is 247 billion. The Columbia Center for Sustainable Development's estimates are, they focus not so much on NDC, but on the low carbon energy transition. So that's why their estimate is that less than 4 billion is actually what is currently being spent. So their gap is 132 billion. And the African Development Bank's estimate of the gap is 99 billion. So somewhere between 99 and 240 billion is the gap when it comes to financing, in particular the energy transition. But NDCs, some NDCs go a little bit beyond energy. But on the whole, at the core, they're about climate and energy. So this doesn't include the investment requirements to go beyond energy. So, the adaptation question, the water questions, biodiversity, all of that, those are also important and wide and significant challenges. So if we look at from a financing point of view, Africa's financial challenges, only 2% of the 2.8 trillion that of climate finance invested between 2000 and 2020 went to Africa. So you would have thought it would have been much higher, given the fact that if Africa energizes using fossil fuels, the world is toast. But that's not the case. The cost of capital is one of the biggest barriers. Between 5 and 15% is what African countries are paying for capital. And compare that to developed countries, which is between 1 and 2%, especially before the rise in interest rates. And 63%, and why this is important, 63% of all climate finance is actually debt. Only 16% of that is concessional, and only around 5% is grant. 37 of the 69 poorest countries are in debt, and most of those are in Africa. Between 3 and 5% of African GDP, it is estimated in a recent report by the African Climate Foundation, as spent on climate responses. And we also have the problem of capital flight. Capital flight is the illegal outflow of capital. And here you can see the estimates: 2 trillion into tax havens between 1970 and 2014, 2.4 trillion if you add interest. That's 3 times African debt in 2018. And ODA didn't really compensate for the losses. So I mean, this is just a snapshot of the challenges that many African countries face. And so there is a narrative which says you can't expect African countries to worsen their debt or to deepen their levels of debt distress in order to mitigate climate change in a way that is going to have negative impacts on their own problems. So that raises the question of grant finance, yes, but it also raises the question of new kinds of finance, cheapening the cost of capital, and that in turn talks to a much wider challenge that many African presidents are now and prime ministers are stepping into, which is the call to reform the global financial system. So if you read the Nairobi, you see I'm really marketing this Nairobi Declaration. You're all going to rush out and read, and maybe you've already downloaded the last part of the declaration, about a third, is devoted to this theme: reforming the global financial system, because basically the rules of the game fundamentally disadvantage African countries. And those numbers that I've just showed you are just indicators of that dysfunctionality. And this report on the right, which was published just a few weeks ago by the Africa Climate Foundation, but primarily written by Carlos Lopez. Carlos Lopez used to be the Secretary General of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And basically, it's a fantastic compendium of all the major initiatives around the world that could have an impact on changing the rules of the game in a way that favors the African context. But there's big players in this game now. So the United Nations Secretary General is vociferous about the need to change the global financial system. And in the recent SDG report on the achievement of the recent Secretary General's report on the achievement of the SDGs, there's pages and pages of financial data which are deeply alarming and concerning to underpin the statement that you see on the right-hand side. But the name of the game, the gold standard in this global discussion, was laid down by Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, and it's known as the Bridgetown Initiative. And the Bridgetown Initiative, it's got all sorts of complications to it, but in essence, this is what it is. Firstly, make the global financial system more shock absorbing. And two mechanisms are referred there. The first is pause clauses. In other words, insert clauses into debt financing agreements that make it possible to pause repayments for up to 2 years in the event of climate shocks, which sounds sensible. I mean, they come anyway. So you have to just recognize the reality. But the much more significant and important part of this part of the Bridgetown Initiative has been absorbed into all the global initiatives. Don't forget, India is leading the G20 at the moment, and they're pushing this agenda. Egypt hosted the COP27. They pushed this agenda, which was to rethink the SDR dispensation. And what's that? SDR stands for Special Drawing Rights. Special drawing rights are issued by the IMF on an irregular basis, and mostly to developed countries. What are SDRs? SDRs are clusters of the most stable currencies, and they are effectively a form of liquidity that gets plopped into central banks around the world, in particular developed countries, in order to oil the wheels of global financial liquidity. So what Africa, the Global South, but also the UN system, etc., a big report has just been published by all the big UN agencies in collaboration with the World Bank, IMF, even the World Trade Organization, saying this agenda matters. And at the center of it is for the IMF to issue on an annual basis a basket of SDRs mainly for developing countries. And if they did that, if they created certainty, if they had a Global South orientation, it would change very, very fundamentally the cost of capital and the global rules of the game when it comes to financing the green transition, because you can also tag what those funds can be used for. The second is to unblock the flow of private capital, which doesn't really go to developing countries, through a whole new global system of guarantees and hopefully transcending this dichotomy in the global system between stable and risky currencies, which is what drives up the cost of capital for developed countries. Thirdly, triple the size of the multilateral development banks, partly by just sweating the assets, in other words, do your job better, which is essentially what the G20 Capital Adequacy Report said. And hits global headlines, because basically it said, you've got a bunch of assets, use them better. But much more importantly, to inject new capital injections into these MDBs over the next 10 years, so that you can get to a dispersal rate of between 500 billion and $1 trillion a year. But that whole Motley initiative and all these discussions, including the UN reports, ignore the fact that the MDBs are not the only DFIs, development financial institutions. There's 522 DFIs now around the world, big and small. They have an asset base of $25 trillion, and they invest about $23 trillion, and they invest $2.5 trillion per annum, which is equal to 10% of total investment. And these are ignored. So if these also tripled in size, you start getting close to some of the estimates of what's needed to achieve the SDGs, which is now ranging between 3.9 trillion per annum and 5 trillion per annum, which as the basic needs, what's required if you want to achieve the SDGs. And then fourthly, the loss and damage fund, which was agreed at the last COP with no money, still has no money, and there's lots of intense negotiations on how to fund it. For example, I would suggest something like using the CBAM taxes. These are the carbon border taxes, which are pretty anti-developmental. But if you put them into a loss and damage fund, they become more developmental. You could see this with SDRs, etc. So I don't want to dwell on that. I just wanted to give you a sense of what this very significant initiative is all about. And so I want to end here by just talking about some of my own work that feeds into this agenda. So I'm a commissioner on the National Planning Commission, and I head up two task teams. One is on infrastructure, and the other one is on finance. And the infrastructure task team is essentially a partnership between the National Planning Commission, the Presidential Climate Commission. So for the non-South Africans here, from the titles, you can guess what these are. The National Treasury, which is our state within a state, and the Development Bank of Southern Africa, which is a state-owned infrastructure bank. And what we're doing is doing very detailed, very expensive assessments of the investment requirements, not costs, investment requirements to achieve net zero by 2050 and energy security, water security progressively through 2030 to 2050, and our digital migration into the 21st century. And all of that, obviously, I don't need to go say anything more for people like you about why those are significant, because without significantly increasing investments in these three sectors, there isn't much hope for the South African economy. And on the whole, the preliminary results from all of the studies is that if you add together the public and private levels of investment, it's at most 2/3 of what is required. So the gap is anything between 1/3 and 50% of the actual requirements to achieve the goals of the National Development Plan. And so this is coupled to climate modeling work that WITS is doing, which is basically saying, yes, all very well, but there are massive negative impacts coming down the pipe. For example, with a lot of confidence, many of the climate scientists are predicting a day zero event, in other words, no water for Gauteng, with the coming El Nino phenomenon that is starting to already hit us with the current heat waves. But also major threats to the maize crop. So the climate modeling is being done, but our general equilibrium models are inadequate because they don't include finance and they don't have a climate damage factor. So we are building a non-equilibrium macroeconomic model that will start being able to integrate these kinds of estimates so that you can start getting realistic rather than these idealistic estimations of what is required, taking into account the dynamics of the macroeconomy. And the second task team really aims to address the question, well, okay, now we have a sense of the investment requirements, which are also maturing in many other parts of Africa where just transition work is taking place. How do we raise the capital, and how do we think about the mobilization of capital on scale? And there's two basic positions when it comes to thinking about investing. The one is essentially leave it to the market, price, give carbon a price, endogenize your externalities and let the market rip. The governor of our Reserve Bank recently gave a speech at a university where he articulated that position. And the second is what you could call green Keynesianism, basically tax, borrow, and spend, focused on treasuries, national treasuries, doing the heavy lifting. And then on the other extreme, modern monetary theory says, no, let the central banks print money if you have currency sovereignty, basically green QE, green quantitative easing. Now, neither of those positions are going to work in South Africa and on the African countries. It might work other places. The market is too slow, and to overburden national treasuries and central banks with the responsibilities means that when crisis hits, they have no wriggle room to intervene to manage the crisis. So you have to think of a different way. And that's the work we're doing in the finance task team. We're meeting with a group of experts at the Union Buildings on the 4th of December. And we're bringing into the mix someone called Stefan Moreau, who is a Berlin-based researcher and has developed this notion of a monetary architecture approach, which is done for the Eurozone. And it's essentially built on quite a simple proposition. which is a financial ecosystem can be understood as a web of interlocking balance sheets. Everybody's in a credit-based economy, i.e., post gold standard 1971. Everybody's liability is somebody else's asset. If you accept that proposition, all balance sheets are actually interlocked and interwoven with each other. And that empirical reality makes it possible to do what hasn't been done, which is to develop a systems view of the financial system. We have an institutionalist perspective, public-private sector. We don't have a systems view of the financial system. Just put aside public and private, systems view of the whole ecosystem as a set of interlocking balance sheets. Once you have that, you could then start identifying what one could call elasticity spaces, i.e., those balance sheets that could be substantially expanded. After all, the transition that we are talking about is about a creative destruction. It's about the massive devaluation and stranding of a whole bunch of assets that become redundant, and the construction of massive swathes of new infrastructures across the world in both developed and developing countries. In a credit-based system, you can only do that off balance sheets. They don't exist anywhere else. They exist on balance sheets. Which balance sheets? And which ones have got the greatest potential to be sweated and expanded through clever reconfigurations of institutional incentives, guarantees, subsidies, etc., etc. So both of these exercises click together quite well, and I think it provides a kind of lab for change for many other developing countries. We were first on quite a number of just transition things. Hopefully, we'll also be first in trying to figure out a way that African countries in a resource, carbon, and finance-constrained world can actually mobilize the capital required to achieve what we need to achieve. And so I end off with a question, which is, can we dare to break free from old solutions to new problems? Thank you.
All right, we have plenty of time for questions and discussions. Any questions for Mark? How do I see what's online? Over there.
Can't see. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Just yeah.
Just testing. Okay, cool. My name is Etienne Goveni. I'm an industrial engineering master's candidate right here in Stellenbosch University. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. So I have a sequence of questions, but some have answers like along while you're presenting. You mentioned that African governments are bigger than countries like China, and yet most of them, they depend on such countries for foreign direct investments. So the first question was, is it a good thing to depend on foreign direct investment from such countries? And then the answer was like, it's not a good thing because you mentioned that there is 7 countries of the 69 are the poorest countries that are in debt crisis. And then the other one was, what can African countries do to fix this? And then now, that's the main question that I have. You mentioned the importance of the young labor force, but I'm pretty sure it's most of us in the room. So how can we as young people now play a big role in curbing this crisis that we have, like having been on a crisis for debt? Now, how do we play a big role in policy? How do we play a big role in sustainability? So thank you.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, great question. And there's no silver bullet. So there isn't one way. You have to develop a landscape of options and build networks with different players operating at different levels. So for many young people, the entrepreneurial opportunities are opening up on a big scale, especially IT linked, but hopefully it goes beyond just IT for consumption, but IT for production, which is the big opportunity. And there's more and more venture capital on the African continent, and more investment capital from outside of the continent that is going into more entrepreneurial activity. So that's a huge opportunity space. The policy space is tricky because it's locked up by elites who kind of trade favors with each other, and it looks like there's change. There's not a lot of change. And so it's a kind of closed shop. But what shakes the cage of those closed shops is the uprisings. So social movements, civic action, media activism. Somebody called it the dictatorship of the clickocracy. You know, the mobilization of social media and coupled to what's happening on the street becomes an important way of opening up political space. And then I think the last point that I would make is we are already, but it's going to become much more overt in a debt crisis. And a debt crisis often results in a political shakeout, and sometimes war and violence. So the challenge that we're going to face as Africans is to stop thinking that the only source of capital is FDI. That is a fundamental problem, and that most of that FDI is actually private capital. And so what we as Africans do is we say to people outside of Africa, please go to your banks and get money and lend it to us in dollars and euros. Those banks basically create the credit. That's what banks do. They're creators of credit. They extend that to an intermediary that then comes to us, and we pay them off in dollars and euros. We have got African banks now. There are 133 development finance institutions of African. There's a growing number of. We've got the largest number of sovereign wealth funds compared to any other region in the world, and we have growing and substantial pension funds. We have to actually rethink the financial ecosystems of African countries and say we're going to borrow from ourselves and pay ourselves back in our local currencies. We have to do that. And there's a big opportunity on how to do that. Even for small entrepreneurs, we're inventing trading systems on the African continent so that you can buy furniture in Nigeria, pay in Naira, using South African rands without converting through a dollar. So there are new trading systems on the continent that allow Africans to trade through local currencies. Those need to be expanded.
Any other questions?
Yes, over here.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. Indeed, much appreciated. My name is Tawana Collins Mzamwese. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Twente, Netherlands, but I ordinarily stay in Zimbabwe, neighboring South Africa. So I've got two questions. You raised an issue that on one of the three typologies that you were talking about sustainability, ESG implementation in industry was critical. So what I wanted to ask is, how do you see cooperation between industry, academia, and government in that sort of transition? To say, is industry working well with government? Is academia working well with the industry? Or are we working in our different silos? Then I liked also your presentation on the Nairobi Declaration, which I'm already looking into after being encouraged But as I also am looking at it, I wanted you to comment on whether you think we can achieve the commitments of the Nairobi Declaration, given that as Africa, over the years, we've come up with a number of blueprints. I think we already have Agenda 2063 for Africa in terms of Africa we want by 2063. And also we have the African Continental Free Trade Area. So what would be your own projection in terms of the implementation of the commitments of the Nairobi Declaration so that we don't suffer the same fate of having good documents then that end up not being implemented?
So just on your last point, who's at fault? Is the problem the declarations, or is the problem us for not implementing them? And the reason why that somewhat facetious question is important is that academics in particular have got a nice little cottage industry critiquing all of these commitments on the grounds that they never get implemented. And it's nice to have them out there, and then you then do the research and you demonstrate empirically how basically failure once again. So the counterfoil to that is, well, is the solution not to have them? And if you don't have them, you don't have any chance of directionality. You have no chance of broader goals against which for those people who do want to get something done, there isn't a consensus of where one should go. So I would be defensive of, yes, the repeated commitments we often make at African summits. A lot depends on the work that then goes into building the coalitions of the willing, the partnerships, the collaborations that make it possible to realize. And I think behind the Nairobi Declaration, there is sufficient financial stakes in order to get minds focused. That if we don't get our act together as Africans, 2% of climate finance is the best that we can hope for. And the result will be that we simply don't take advantage of where the rest of the world is going. So the Nairobi Declaration at the moment is the best we have with respect to saying we would like to join the global revolution underway. And that has major advantages for African economies. I mean, there is a lot of contestation on the continent, including in South Africa. So we don't have a political settlement at the national level around direction because we have Gwede Mantashe with one vision and most of the other ministers with a different vision. But he's very powerful. So we don't actually ever really get out of the starting blocks. So on the other question, I mean, underlying your question is a normative statement, which is there should be collaboration between industry and academia around building knowledge to support innovation, triple helix, all of that kind of stuff. And a lot of people are looking at ESG as a way for articulating that relationship. In other words, ESG as a framework for learning within firms who then need to access outside knowledge and therefore knowledge partnerships, et cetera, et cetera. I'm a bit skeptical of ESG, to be honest. If ESG started off with good intentions, which is companies should do good. And when not many companies bought into that, the ESG activists repackaged ESG as, well, if you do ESG, your bottom line improves. And that kind of, many people believe that. And if you look at the literature on ESG, it's overwhelmingly to prove that if you do ESG, your bottom line improves. But you need to ask a question, what impact does it have on society? And there's not a lot about that. And so there's a growing dissatisfaction, I think, that I'm picking up, and a need for what Johan Scott at Utrecht University calls transformative frameworks. And a couple of European banks are starting to explore defining their purpose as systemic change. When you define your purpose as systemic change, then the investment decisions you make need to be rated against, is this going to have a systemic impact, not just on your own bottom line, but on society? And I think we need to move in that direction, to be honest. And without universities, I don't think it's achievable.
Thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. It was very nice. I think there's a lot of complexity around everything that you mentioned, and it carries wide over. I really appreciate your view of the systems view of economic, the ecosystem. I think that would actually.
I saw you nodding your head.
Yeah.
Is this where you come from?
I'm a natural engineer. We like putting things together.
Yes.
But I do think that will have quite a lot of value and creating cohesion between all these different aspects. Because there's also not a lot of transparency between these different areas. I mean, we've mentioned the difference between the government, private sector, and the academia, and that would all bring it together to give that transparency. And then what I also thought about is, yeah, I mean, we've got great plans, meaning touching on the implementation. We've got the National Development Plan that was developed in 2010 already. It is an excellent plan, but it was never really developed. It was never really implemented. So I think right across Africa, and especially in South Africa, that is one of our main problems, is that we're lacking implementation. And having more visibility around the different systems and maybe better governance would help us implement that. But then I find it conflicting in two areas. You spoke about the policy locking in capital, and I mean, we all hear about all these capital and funds being sent to Africa, but once again, we don't see that the work from that being implemented.
Yes.
And then secondly, we talk about the available venture capital that would drive entrepreneurship and job creation for the youth that we see, the growing youth in Africa. Because currently we've got a major amount of youth growing, but most of them don't have job opportunities. And we end up losing the best of them to the rest of the world.
Yes.
So how do you see that? I find that those two slightly conflicting. So,
no, spot on. Absolutely spot on. It's true. There's a lot of climate funding that has come into the continent over the last 5 years, and some of it has never been spent. There's whole chunks sitting, like in Ethiopia is a good example, not spent for 3 years. And then Africans kind of moan that they're not getting enough. So that's a fundamental contradiction. And we're just starting a research project on that. With 4 case studies, working in partnership with the African Association of Development Finance Institutions, because the DFIs could actually play a much more significant role as lead arrangers rather than the banks of last resort. And they may be more appropriate for locating those funds than treasuries or basically they sit in national treasuries. So that's absolutely spot on. Yeah. And if you contrast the kind of non-deployment of capital versus the hunger amongst the youth entrepreneurs for investment capital and venture, I mean, venture capital to be venture capital means 80% of it fails for 20% to succeed. And if you don't have the depth of venture capital in a society, that room for the investment in failure doesn't happen. And so you don't really have the emergence of the tried and tested entrepreneurs who can really pull things through. So yeah, it's a fundamental contradiction. There has to be a linkage. There are some funding initiatives trying to bridge that gap, kind of ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, with a entrepreneurial orientation. Hard to do because governments are clumsy, blunt instruments. And the kind of venture capital you need is got to be quite refined in the decisions that are made on who you invest in. And those two don't always go together, those methodologies.
Great. Question to Devin.
Sorry, we've got time.
Okay.
I have a question, and actually it connects with the previous question, just on the so the sense of excellence approach. I think you wrote about this with regards to the energy transition. It's kind of antithetical to a labor absorption approach, right?
Yes.
In some way, because like, what do we do with? So we've got these senses of excellence that like getting stuff done. Like, what do we do about the rest of everyone? Given a huge labor force, and then also, yeah, in connection. This is just an ask the brain drain. What do we do about that? And is there interlocking balance sheets, the elasticity associated with that, being designed to absorb labor?
Yeah, so the idea of centers of excellence and the political settlements you need to protect those centers of excellence has emerged from a very influential body of literature, which is the developmental state literature. So up until probably a few years ago, the conversation in Africa about development was dominated by an image of what made development work in Southeast Asia. So you had the Southeast Asian tigers, and they were then designated as having built developmental states. And those developmental states were able to operate in a certain way, combining interventionism with enabling the market in order to fast track modernization, industrialization, and urbanization. So that was the model, then gets imported into African context. And then the researchers, the job of the researcher was to figure out, well, under what conditions can we build these developmental states so that we can then have development? There's two fundamental problems with that. The first is what Africans thought happened in Southeast Asia is not really what happened. It was much messier, much more complex, much more 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So we idealized. So we tried to copy an idealization. So that was the first problem. And that was one death knell to that literature. The second is it created, including in South Africa after 2002, when the South African government adopted the developmental state narrative, it created the impression you first have to build a developmental state in order to then have development. And you never actually get there. So we, in the National Development Plan, we called it building a capable state. Well, in 2010, we said we're going to build a capable state. And then we had 9 wasted years under Zuma, where we basically destroyed the state. And then we ended off with the Zondo Commission. It says, you really did a good job of doing the opposite of building a capable state. So what's emerged in different parts of Africa and starting to emerge here is the idea that, well, you can't create the structure first and then do development. You have to do what you can. Do the best that you can in particular corners of the system. Secure political deals between factions, between bureaucratic elites and political factions, business elites, in order to have these centers of excellence where you have expertise that can do their job, well-motivated expertise, small groups that can actually get stuff done. And without that, it sounds very elitist. Without that, the big things don't happen. Let me just give you one case study, just a simple case study, rather than getting lost in the South African morass. Gabon has got a lot of timber. The Chinese like logs. So they just want to cut the trees, export it to China, and then they process it. But there's a little nascent furniture industry there. That's saying that don't export the logs. Let's make the furniture and export the furniture. Obvious thought, okay? Creates new value chains, increases the value of your exports, you meet the market, blah, 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 blah. Who are the Chinese connected to? Which political elites? Well, the political elites that are dominant, that favor, even though it's not government policy to favor the Chinese. So the furniture guys have to form alliances with some officials, some politicians, lobby the president, and get a different dispensation that allows a group to put in place the regulatory frameworks and financial incentives to allow a local furniture industry to grow. They can't do it themselves, but they do need that small group in a protected position close to power that can put the framework in place and deal with the Chinese who want to offer them bribes to not do that work. That's what this is. And if you don't have those small groups that enable the construction of opportunity, the people who want to exploit those opportunities just get trampled on all the time. So that's what this new literature is trying to grapple with, the kind of real politique of everyday life in a hectic set of neighborhoods on the global planet.
Oh, okay, great stuff. Do we still have time for more questions? Oh, okay.
We're just doing a photo. If you can ask questions. Are there questions online?
Nobody's asked any questions online, or does anybody want to ask a question online? Okay, Evan, you go ahead.
Okay. So just to give you a bit of background, African entrepreneur, we export additive manufacturing facilities, so 3D printing facilities all over Africa. And what we're seeing is, obviously, Africa has its problems with, well, we can only guess and then realize how many more problems we have when we go into these places. But effectively, obviously, the energy being a problem, there's the whole African Free Trade Agreement, which I find is more of a problem than a solution. And then one thing we're finding is when we export, we bring it in at market value from Europe. And then when we sell, we have people that do all the who you know in the African regions. They add their markup. And we found that the import tax for machinery in West Africa particularly is almost 100%. So effectively, the machines that are costing X amount in Europe are costing 3 times more for Africa. So it's not as competitive as everyone thinks, and manufacturing in Africa, then it becomes a lot more difficult. What would your outlook on Africa's manufacturing be, positive, negative? And do you think there's things happening in the background that could improve your outlook or the manufacturing state?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great case study, and case studies are always very illuminating. And it would be really interesting I'm just trying to imagine all the links along the value chain and where the possible intervention points might be, which would, for example, raise a question: what portion of those components could be manufactured somewhere on the African continent, here or elsewhere? But the way to answer your wider question, I would have answered this question very differently 5 years ago. And the reason is that over the last couple of years, my team has worked with the Danish University of Technology to analyze the implications of the local content program in South Africa. So these are local content regulations for what needs to be locally sourced to build renewable energy power stations, wind farms or windmills. And on the whole, the local content program didn't work very well. But where it did work extremely well, was where local companies entered into very strong partnerships with international companies, including getting employed by some of those international companies, building the skills base, then moving out and setting up their own companies. And as a result of this quite almost ethnographic research into the actual dynamics of implementing local content, the conclusion was that the learning curves when it comes to manufacturing are not at all steep. They take years, and you have to build capacity over a very long period of time, and you have to have the right financial incentives and frameworks, including venture capital, to support failure. And we don't have a lot of that. So the way the state responded to local content program was to facilitate the establishment of companies. That the state set up certain companies in order to take, with funding, with technology and capacity, to take up parts of the value chain. But the developers have these very trust-based relationships with their OEMs, because these are sensitive equipment. They want to keep on buying from the same people, knowing that there's not going to. So they're not going to buy from a South African company, but they will buy from a South African company that has built a track record, and that's what takes time. So I think the overall lesson for me is that we're going to have to get into this manufacturing space within the context of the free trade, identifying who can do what in different environments, and there's lots of different combinations of resources and capabilities that could be networked together in order to come up with African-based value chains. But it's going to be much harder than most people think. That's my overall conclusion.
One more question over here somewhere.
I've got a question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Stan Msisia. I am a PhD student here at Stellenbosch University, working on process design and economic and sustainability analysis for the biorefineries stroke facilities for converting agricultural residues into useful products. You have made a very beautiful presentation, and I'm so much interested into the details. But I wanted to ask, having made policies or declarations and other documents, do you think that there is something missing to do with the responsibility? I mean, who are we answerable to? Or whoever doesn't implement, who are they answerable to? I think probably the task, whatever tasks or whatever action plans that are within the documents are not well broken down to assign specific parts to specific individuals who we know for sure they are within or under some bureaucratic, they are under some under some leadership, so that if they don't perform their tasks properly, maybe we can make use of the structures that are already existing within our governments, so that we can facilitate the implementation, because for sure they are not implemented, yet we have structures within our governments, within our continent, or whatever bodies, to look after such. Another thing is, I wanted to ask, or maybe ask for your comments on the way we approach our discussions as African continent. We make documents, or we make whatever process as an African policy or something that is applicable to Africa, but we don't implement it as Africa. For example, the Agenda 2063, it's how we want Africa to be by 2063. But then the implementation is, for example, I come from Malawi. It really speaks about Malawi only. You never hear, even when it was being launched, there was nothing like South Africa or Tanzania, or it's purely Malawi. So it's like we want to implement it in isolation, not as an African continent. And therefore, even though we may know that South Africa has some laboratories or some research centers that Malawi could use to implement part of the vision, but since we are not mentioning, since there are no links to any other African country, then probably could be one of the major challenges. I don't know what you could say on that, and maybe what is already being done when you look at the things. Thank you.
Well, you're the link. You're the link. So underlying your questions is some very complicated, almost epistemological questions and complexities around what do we think a state is. So when you say that a policy document should have greater detail and specify exactly who should do what, I can see what concept of state you have in mind. You have in mind a state which is a hierarchy, which has got capacity at multiple levels, and can actually give direction and instructions and make sure people do their jobs. That's the underlying conception of the state. Now, when I hear a suggestion that policy documents should specify in much greater detail who should do what, I get the cold shivers. That's the last thing that I want bureaucrats to have the power to do, because absolutely for sure they're going to mess it up. And the clue to the alternative is in your second question, which is why don't we collaborate better? So a lot of the work that we do in my center is to reinvent the conception of the state using the notion of relational governance. And what that simply boils down to is, what are the kinds of relationships, modes of cooperation, facilitated capacity to collaborate, all of the ways of getting things done, which don't fit with our traditional concept of the state as a hierarchy with power to allocate and drive. Do you see what I'm getting at? Let me just give you one practical example, which questions your underlying, which is not actually it's almost an unconscious conception of the state that you expect to exist. I can tell you now, it's never going to happen. It'll never happen because in a complex world, those kinds of institutions can't get built. In a complex world, everything is intertwined, interlocked, continuously moving, highly fluid, and the people who have the advantage and capacity, the advantage in those kinds of systems are the people who can build partnerships, facilitate relationships, and build coherence that lasts for as long as the task at hand and morphs into something else. That's a very different conception of the state. To give you one example, in the Western Cape, we have something called the Economic Development Partnership that used to be led by an extraordinary character called Andrew Borain, who has, like me, a very long history in our change processes. We work together most of our lives. And the EDP is set up by government to facilitate partnering between government departments and between levels of government, and if there's still time, with people outside of government. And they developed and articulated an extraordinarily sophisticated narrative to enable people from different departments, different levels of government, different sectors of society to come together to collaborate to deal with a challenge. And that challenge in 2018 was the water crisis. Cape Town ran out of water. In 3 months, they eliminated 50% of the consumption with no technological interventions. Why? Because eventually people collaborated. If you had a state issuing instructions, don't consume water, nothing would have happened. Are you with me? In the African context, this notion of a hierarchical state with capacity to order things around most of the time translates into dictatorship. If we're interested in democracy on the African, we have to reinvent our conception of the state and of governance. And we have to do it urgently and quickly. But you know what the problem is? We think other places worked because they had that conception. And so we want it here. Our image of what, like the developmental states in Southeast Asia, our conception of what existed is idealized. It's not the real thing. And we now try and implement it in our context, which is extremely complex. And then we wonder why it doesn't work. Get rid of those images. We have to reinvent the state.